know that some people, when they're looking at the status of Congress and its sort of unwillingness to uphold its constitutional duties and its ability to check the executive, do you have hope in the courts that some of their rulings might curb the behavior of an aggressive administration?
I do. I think the courts are, for the next 12 to 18 months until the political cycle really begins to rev up for midterm elections, probably the place where you'll see the biggest pushback, and from private litigants who are and advocacy groups that are very bravely pushing back on lots of different fronts in the courts. Because foundationally, what the Trump administration is doing really pushes the limit of the law as we understand it. I think a lot of it is unlawful. There may be some in the gray areas where they have arguments. And the Trump administration really is relying upon obfuscation, distraction, the kind of forest and trees point I made before about trying to focus on these as a bunch of small measures while distracting from the big actual macro policy objective that's being advanced. There is an effort really underway right now in litigation around foreign assistance funding that's really extraordinary, where they have spent the last 2 weeks openly ignoring, under very loose and flimsy legal pretext, a direct order from the court to implement certain types of payments back in place. And they've pushed back on it and pushed back on it. And now the court has really slapped them down, and they're seeking an appeal. We'll see what comes of it. But in the end, those sorts of case management measures are things traditionally district courts get a fair amount of leeway on.
Right.
So unless you get some big overriding, constitutional principle, a higher court, in this case it would probably have to be the Supreme Court, intervenes on, and that may happen in certain of the cases where you've seen officials removed contrary to statutory restrictions, and there's that unitary executive theory. I don't think you're likely to see it in these funding cases, but it's possible, but I don't think so. That's going to be a real pushback for the courts, for the Trump administration. They're going to be called out saying what you're doing is unlawful, and you're not even complying with the temporary measures to keep things static while we resolve the bigger legal questions. Then the question becomes, well, what if the Trump administration just ignores these things and doesn't comply with them? And that is a hard question. Traditionally, the courts have really relied on the executive branch actually acting in good faith. It's worth noting the executive branch, even under the first Trump administration, did always abide by these. There's no real clear example of them really meaningfully ignoring these judicial orders. And the types of pushback we've seen so far, while I think not in good faith and highly problematic, particularly on the foreign assistance front and other funding fronts, are not yet to the point that you would say that they're beyond the pale. They're clearly ignoring the law. They are putting legal pretexts and arguments around what the administration is doing, and kind of daring the courts to push back on that. And now the court has in this particular case, and we'll see what happens.